The changing room door slammed shut with a metallic finality that echoed through the concrete hallway of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Thorne stood motionless, her back pressed against cold steel lockers as three pairs of boots shuffled closer across the damp floor. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters across the faces of men who decided she didn't belong. Staff Sergeant Vance led them, his breath hot with morning coffee and certainty. Behind him, two corporals whose names she hadn't bothered learning yet. They'd made assumptions the moment her orders came through, assumptions about the woman with silver threading her dark hair, about the 42 years that sat in the fine lines around her eyes, about what those 2 decades before her current assignment really meant. Vance's hand moved toward her collar, and the fluorescent hum seemed to grow louder in the suspended moment before contact. 20 years earlier, Kestrel had been someone else entirely. A different name on different orders, operating in places that didn't officially exist, doing work that would never make it into any public record. The Navy had a way of burying its deepest secrets, and she'd been one of them. DVGRU didn't advertise its operators, especially not the ones who'd broken barriers that weren't supposed to exist in the first place. She'd earned her trident in blood and silence, had pulled triggers in 13 countries across 4 continents, had carried wounded brothers through water and fire, had made decisions in microseconds that meant life or death for people whose faces she still saw when she closed her eyes. The muscle memory lived in her bones, in the way her weight distributed without thought, in how her breathing slowed when threat assessment kicked in the angle of her chin as she calculated distances and vulnerabilities. But here, in this changing room at a forward base in Syria's northern corridor, none of that mattered to men who saw only what they wanted to see. Vance's fingers brushed her flight suit collar. His smirk carried the weight of every doubt he'd voiced in the operations tent, every whispered comment about age and capability, every assumption that her assignment flying close air support in an A-10 Thunderbolt II was some diversity checkbox rather than earned qualification. The other 2 corporals had positioned themselves to block the door, thinking this was about intimidation, about establishing pecking order, about putting someone in their place. They'd constructed an entire narrative about who she was based on nothing but their own limited imagination. What they didn't know was that Kestrel had spent 2 decades in rooms far more dangerous than this one, facing men far more committed to violence than these 3 would ever be. Her eyes, pale gray like winter sky, locked onto Vance's with the same calm she'd maintained in interrogation resistance training, in compromised safe houses, in the seconds before breaching doors behind which anything might wait. The moment stretched, and in it, everything was about to change. Kestrel's left hand moved with the efficiency of muscle memory trained through 10,000 repetitions. She caught Vance's wrist mid-reach, her thumb finding the pressure point between radius and ulna with surgical precision. His smirk dissolved into confusion, then shock as she rotated his arm outward, using his own forward momentum against him. The biomechanics were simple, physics perfected through application. His body followed the joint lock involuntarily, pivoting him sideways into the lockers with a hollow boom that reverberated through metal. The other 2 corporals lurched forward, their coordination absent, their training adequate for garrison duty, but not for this. She released Vance's wrist and sidestepped the first corporal's grab with minimal movement, her body already positioned for the counter. Her right palm struck his solar plexus with controlled force, enough to empty his lungs and fold him forward, not enough to cause lasting damage. The second corporal hesitated, that fatal pause where bravado met reality. Kestrel didn't give him time to decide. She swept his lead leg, guiding him down rather than slamming him, her hand catching his collar to control the descent. Within 8 seconds, all 3 men were on the floor, gasping, their entire worldview recalibrating. She stepped back, her breathing still calm, her pulse barely elevated. This was nothing. This didn't even register compared to the chaos she'd operated in before most of these men had graduated high school. "Stay down," she said, her voice carrying none of the heat they'd brought into this room. "You're going to listen now." Vance struggled to his knees, one hand pressed against his side where the locker had caught him. His face had gone red, equal parts embarrassment and rage. But something else flickered behind his eyes now, the first crack in his certainty. She stood with her back to the door, cutting off their exit, establishing that this moment would end on her terms. 20 years, she began, her tone flat, factual. 20 years in the teams. DVGRU. SEAL Team 6 if you need the familiar name. I've got more combat drops than all three of you combined have training jumps. I've called in airstrikes on targets you'll never read about, extracted assets from situations that would give you nightmares, and made decisions under fire that kept people alive who deserved to go home. The second corporal, still on the floor, made a sound that might have been disbelief. She ignored it. "I didn't transfer to aviation to slow down. I transferred because after 2 decades of close quarters work, I wanted to provide the kind of support I used to call for. The A-10 isn't some cushy retirement plan. It's the most dangerous close air support platform we fly, and it requires knowing ground operations intimately to do it right. Every trigger pull, every gun run, every danger close mission means I'm responsible for lives on the ground. Your lives if you ever get outside the wire." She crouched down to Vance's level, her eyes meeting his. "You came in here to prove something, to establish dominance, to put me in my place." She paused, letting the words settle. "You failed. Not because I'm better than you at your job, I don't know if I am, but because you made assumptions without data, and in our line of work, assumptions get people killed." The door opened behind her. Captain Renner, the operations officer, stood framed in the entrance, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the scene. The operations tent hummed with the perpetual noise of war's administrative engine. Cooling fans battled against Syrian heat, radio traffic crackled through speakers, and junior officers updated the tactical display with grease pencil marks that tracked friendly and enemy positions across laminated maps. Captain Renner sat behind a field desk constructed from ammunition crates and plywood, his fingers steepled as he studied Kestrel across the improvised workspace. Vance and his 2 corporals stood at attention to her right, their earlier confidence replaced by rigid military bearing that couldn't quite hide their discomfort. The witness statements had been collected, the incident report filed. Now came the consequences. Renner was career infantry, a man who'd earned his captaincy through competent leadership in Ramadi and Sangin, who understood that discipline maintained unit cohesion, and who'd built his reputation on fairness within the brutal mathematics of military justice. His eyes moved between the 4 people before him, calculating, weighing the cost of different courses of action. Kestrel stood at parade rest, her face impassive. She'd been through enough command investigations to know when silence served better than explanation. "Lieutenant Commander," Renner began, his Texas accent flattening the syllables, "I've reviewed the statements. Staff Sergeant Vance claims he was reaching for his locker when contact was initiated. The corporals corroborate this version." He paused, letting the lie sit in the air between them. "Your account differs significantly." "Yes, sir," Kestrel replied, offering nothing more. Renner's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm assigning you to Hound 42 for tomorrow's patrol support mission. You'll be flying solo support for a platoon conducting village clearing operations in the Euphrates Valley. High probability of contact with ISIS remnants. Rules of engagement remain standard, but understand that the ground element specifically requested a different pilot." The words carried their intended weight. This was punishment disguised as assignment, sending her up alone to support troops who already doubted her, where any mistake would be magnified, where the lack of trust from the ground could mean hesitation in calling for support when they needed it most. Kestrel had seen this play before, had watched the institutional machine protect its own while putting outsiders in positions to fail. "Understood, sir," she said. Vance's shoulders relaxed slightly, sensing victory. Renner dismissed them all with a gesture, but as the three men filed out, he called Kestrel back. "Close the door," he said quietly. She complied, turning back to find Renner's expression had shifted. The official mask had cracked, revealing something more complex underneath. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer, the tab marked with classifications she recognized, the kind of paperwork that didn't officially exist in forward operating bases. "I made some calls," Renner said, tapping the folder. "Your service record is mostly redacted. Whole years just blank spaces with classifications I don't have clearance for. But I called in a favor with someone at SOCOM who knows someone who knows. Got off-the-record confirmation about who you really are." Kestrel remained silent, her face giving nothing away. "Vance and his boys are getting off light because I can't prove what happened in that room, and because bringing formal charges would require explaining why. But that mission tomorrow," Renner leaned forward, "that's me giving you the chance to show them who they're really dealing with." Dawn broke over Fob Sentinel with the kind of violent beauty that only desert mornings could produce, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood orange that would burn away to merciless blue within the hour. Kestrel walked the flight line alone, her boots crunching on tarmac still cool from the night. Her pre-flight inspection, a ritual performed with the same attention she'd once given to weapons checks before insertion. The A-10 Thunderbolt II waited like a prehistoric predator rendered in titanium and aluminum, its twin turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage, its straight wings designed for low-altitude punishment rather than grace. The airframe bore the scars of previous missions, panel repairs and patched battle damage that told stories of how much abuse the Warthog could absorb and still bring its pilot home. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets under her palm, the slight roughness where maintenance crews had smoothed over shrapnel scarring. This particular aircraft, tail number 810964, had been flying close air support since the First Gulf War, had probably killed more enemy armor than entire battalions in conventional forces. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon dominated the aircraft's centerline, 7 barrels capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at 4,200 rounds per minute, creating a sound like God's own chainsaw when it spun up. Mounted under the wings, AGM-65 Maverick missiles and Mark 82 bombs hung in configurations optimized for ground interdiction, for destroying hardened positions, for bringing violence to people who'd chosen to make themselves targets. The ground crew chief, a senior airman named Tors who'd watched the entire changing room incident play out through the base rumor mill, approached with her pre-flight checklist. His usual easy banter was absent, replaced by professional curtness that signaled his position clearly. He wanted her to know he sided with his brothers on the ground, that her rank and her record meant less than tribal loyalty to men he drank with in the evenings. "Aircraft is mission capable," Tors reported, his eyes fixed somewhere over her left shoulder. "Fuel at 98%, all weapons systems green, communications package updated, gun loaded with 1,100 rounds." "Countermeasures?" Kestrel asked. "Full load, chaff and flare dispensers operational." She took the clipboard from him, scanning the maintenance log, noting the hydraulic system check from the previous evening, the radar warning receiver test that showed all parameters normal. Everything looked correct, but his body language nagged at her, some subtle wrongness in how he held himself. It was probably nothing, probably just his way of expressing disapproval. But DVGRU had taught her that probably was how you got killed. That instinct was pattern recognition, operating faster than conscious thought. That survival meant listening to the quiet voice that said something was off. "Walk me through the comms check," she said. Tors' jaw tightened. "Already done, it's in the log." "Walk me through it again." For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then military discipline overrode personal loyalty, and he led her to the communications panel access, pulling off the cover to reveal the radio components. The mission brief had been perfunctory, delivered by a first lieutenant whose mustache was attempting to establish authority his face couldn't yet support. Hound 42 consisted of 28 soldiers from 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, tasked with clearing a cluster of buildings along the Euphrates where intelligence suggested ISIS remnants had established a weapons cache. The operation was classified as routine, expected duration 4 hours, probability of contact assessed at moderate. Maps showed the village layout, irrigation channels cutting through ancient agricultural patterns, mud brick compounds with walls high enough to conceal movement, roads that were little more than packed dirt threading between structures that had stood for generations before the current conflict arrived. Lieutenant Ashiro, the platoon leader, had barely looked at Kestrel during the brief. His questions about her response time and weapons availability had been directed to the tactical display rather than to her, as if she were some remote system he was required to incorporate rather than a pilot with 2 decades of operational experience. The other pilots in the ready room had maintained careful neutrality, not openly hostile but not offering support either, occupying the safe middle ground where careers got protected. Now strapped into the A-10's cockpit with canopy closed and engines spooling up, Kestrel ran through her startup sequence with methodical precision. The heads-up display flickered to life, overlaying airspeed and altitude indicators across her field of view. The multifunction displays showed weapons status, threat warnings, targeting information. Her hands moved across controls worn smooth by thousands of previous flights, fingers finding switches and toggles through muscle memory, feet testing rudder pedals that would give her the low-speed maneuverability that made the Warthog deadly in close support. Tower granted her takeoff clearance, and she pushed the throttles forward, feeling 23 tons of aircraft accelerate down the runway with the determined momentum of something built for punishment rather than elegance. The nose wheel lifted at 130 knots, and she rotated skyward, climbing through air that was already beginning to shimmer with heat. Below, the forward operating base receded to geometric patterns, a human footprint pressed into landscape that had been contested for millennia, that would be contested long after America decided its interests lay elsewhere. She banked east toward the Euphrates Valley, following coordinates that would put her on station over Hound 42's area of operations. The flight was smooth, the morning air still relatively calm before thermal currents began churning the atmosphere into turbulence. Through the canopy, Syria stretched below in variations of brown and tan, broken by the green ribbon of irrigated land following the river, by villages that appeared as darker clusters against the desert floor. From up here, it looked almost peaceful, the violence reduced to abstract patterns that didn't show the ruined lives and broken bodies that gave those patterns meaning. Her radio crackled to life. Hog 41, this is Hound 42 actual. We are 15 minutes from objective. Request you maintain station at Angels 12, ready for immediate tasking. Kestrel keyed her mic. Hound 42 actual, Hog 41 copies. On station at Angels 12, full weapons load, playtime 4 hours. Ready to support. Copy that. Ashiro's voice carried audible skepticism even through radio compression. The valley unfolded beneath her wings, the Euphrates flowing with the same indifference it had shown to Akkadians, Romans, Ottomans, and now the latest empire to claim dominion over its banks. 12,000 feet provided perspective that ground forces could never achieve, a god's-eye view where tactical patterns emerged from chaos. Kestrel orbited her assigned station in a lazy racetrack pattern, eyes scanning both the terrain below and the multifunction displays that translated sensor data into actionable information. The village designated as Objective Hawk appeared unremarkable from altitude, perhaps 40 structures clustered around a central square, where a dried fountain stood as monument to better times. Compounds radiated outward like spokes, their walls creating a maze of potential ambush points, of firing positions, of places where explosive devices could be buried beneath dirt that looked identical to dirt everywhere else. The data link showed Hound 42's positions as blue icons creeping toward the village from the northwest, moving with the careful deliberation of soldiers who understood that complacency killed. 4 Humvees had dropped them at a position 2 kilometers out, far enough that engine noise wouldn't announce their approach. Now they moved on foot, 28 men divided into 3 squads plus a headquarters element, their formation textbook perfect for rural terrain where threats could emerge from any angle. Ashiro was keeping his element tight, maintaining interval discipline, using natural depressions for concealment as they advanced. Through her targeting pod, Kestrel could see details that the naked eye would miss. The infrared sensors painted the world in grayscale variations of heat signature, showing the soldiers as bright spots of thermal output, their bodies warmer than the cooling morning earth. She could track their movement, could see how first squad took point while second and third followed in staggered column, could observe the way they used the terrain intelligently, moving from cover to cover even though no hostile activity had been detected. But the village showed life too. Thermal signatures bloomed in several compounds, people beginning their daily routines, cooking fires being lit, the mundane business of existence in a war zone where normalcy was its own form of resistance. Distinguishing combatants from civilians was the eternal problem, the calculation that kept soldiers and pilots awake at night, the decision matrix where perfect information never existed and every choice carried moral weight that numbers couldn't capture. Hog 4-1, Hound 4-2 actual, Ashiro's voice interrupted her scan. We are holding at Checkpoint Alpha. Request updated threat assessment of the objective. Kestrel zoomed her targeting pod, walking it across the village in systematic sweeps. The multifunction display processed the visual data, highlighting anomalies, flagging potential threats based on pattern recognition algorithms that had been fed thousands of examples of what danger looked like from above. Most signatures read as normal civilian activity, but one compound on the village's eastern edge showed something different. 5 male individuals clustered in a courtyard, their movements purposeful rather than casual. One appeared to be working on something mechanical, possibly a vehicle hidden under camouflage netting that created a distinctive visual signature in infrared. Hound 4-2 actual, Hog 4-1. I'm observing possible hostile activity in compound designated Hotel Echo, eastern edge of objective. 5 military-age males, possible vehicle under concealment. Recommend you proceed with caution, be prepared for contact. Silence stretched for 3 seconds, long enough that Kestrel wondered if her transmission had been received. Then Ashiro responded, his tone clipped. Copy, proceeding to objective. The lack of acknowledgement for her tactical assessment wasn't surprising, but it was telling. First squad entered the village at 8:27 hours, their movement cautious and deliberate as they flowed between buildings like water finding channels. From her vantage point 12,000 feet above, Kestrel watched the operation unfold with the detached clarity that altitude provided. The squad leader, a staff sergeant whose name she'd memorized from the brief as Kowalski, positioned his men well, covering angles and maintaining communication through hand signals that were invisible to her but evident in their coordinated movement. They cleared the first compound without incident, finding an elderly couple and 3 children who were separated and held for questioning, while the team continued its sweep. The village remained quiet, almost unnaturally so. Morning routines had stopped the moment armed Americans appeared, civilians retreating behind walls and locked doors with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned survival required invisibility. Kestrel maintained her orbit, her throttles set to maintain airspeed at 200 knots, her altitude stable, her weapons systems armed and ready, but with the master switch still safed. The rules of engagement were clear. Positive identification of hostile intent or hostile action before weapons release. Intent was the harder metric, the judgment call that separated legitimate defense from murder, the line that got argued in operations centers and courtrooms long after the smoke cleared. Second Squad had moved to the village center now, methodically working through structures that intelligence had flagged as likely cache locations. They used breaching charges on reinforced doors, cleared rooms with the violence of action that special operations had refined into doctrine, found only abandoned spaces and empty ammunition crates that suggested the intelligence had been good but the timing was wrong. The weapons had been here, but they were here no longer. Hog 4-1, Hound 2-6, a new voice on the radio, one of the squad leaders. We've got eyes on your compound. Hotel Echo appears to be the right place. We're observing fortified positions and what looks like a technical vehicle, probably mounted with heavy machine gun. No visual on personnel, but they know we're here. Kestrel adjusted her targeting pod, zooming in on the compound. The camouflage netting she'd spotted earlier was now partially removed, revealing exactly what the squad leader had reported. A Toyota pickup truck with a 14.5 kpv heavy machine gun mounted on a welded frame in the truck bed. The weapon could shred the Humvees that had dropped off Hound 4-2, could punch through body armor, could turn the narrow village streets into a kill zone if it got into action. The 5 individuals she'd tracked earlier were no longer visible in the courtyard, had withdrawn into the compound's main structure. Hound 2-6, Hog 4-1, Kestrel transmitted. Confirm you have eyes on. That technical is your primary threat. I can put a Maverick through that courtyard and eliminate the vehicle, but you need to confirm no civilians in the impact area. The radio hissed with dead air for a moment. Then Ashiro's voice cut through. Negative, Hog 4-1. We're going to handle this organic. Maintain overwatch unless we call for support. Kestrel's jaw tightened. The decision was Ashiro's to make, his authority as ground commander, but it was the wrong decision. Third Squad had positioned themselves to assault compound Hotel Echo, stacking on the gate with tactical discipline that would have looked perfect in training scenarios at Fort Benning. Staff Sergeant Chen, the squad leader whose combat experience showed in the economy of his movements, used hand signals to coordinate his 8 soldiers into optimal positioning. 2 would breach, 4 would flow through the fatal funnel of the gateway, 2 would provide security on their flanks. It was sound tactics for a structure that might contain hostages or valuable intelligence, for a situation where surgical precision was required. But this wasn't that situation. The technical weapon changed the calculation entirely, gave the defenders overwhelming firepower advantage if they got it into action. Kestrel watched helplessly from 12,000 feet, her thumb resting on the weapon's release authorization switch that she couldn't press without clearance from the ground commander. The frustration was familiar, the knowledge that she had the capability to solve this problem cleanly, but was constrained by command decisions made by someone who didn't trust her judgment. In her DEVGRU days, she'd been the one on the ground, had been the trigger puller working with pilots overhead, had understood intimately that supporting the ground element meant anticipating their needs rather than waiting for explicit requests. But those operations had been built on teams that trained together, that trusted each other's competence implicitly, that communicated in shorthand developed through shared experience. This was different. This was working with people who'd already decided she was a liability. Chen's breach team hit the gate with explosive force, the shaped charge blowing the lock and hinges, the door falling inward with a crash that echoed across the village. The assault team flowed through the opening with textbook precision, weapons up and scanning for targets. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the compound erupted. Muzzle flashes sparked from windows of the main structure, automatic weapons fire raking across the courtyard in coordinated bursts that showed training and planning. The technical weapon roared to life, its heavy machine gun opening up with a sound like ripping canvas, amplified through Hell's own speakers. The 14.5 rounds tore through the air where Chen's team had been standing moments before, where their momentum had carried them forward into the courtyard before they recognized the trap they'd entered. 2 soldiers went down immediately, hit in the initial burst, their bodies dropping with the terrible finality of combat casualties. The rest scattered, seeking whatever cover the courtyard provided, returning fire at positions that were fortified and prepared. Contact, heavy contact. Chen's voice on the radio carried the controlled urgency of a professional under fire. We've got 2 down, pinned in compound Hotel Echo, taking fire from prepared positions. Technical weapon is active, danger close. Ashiro's response came immediately. All Hound elements converge on Hotel Echo, suppress that technical. First and second squads broke from their positions, moving toward the sound of gunfire with the aggressive speed that American infantry doctrine emphasized. But they were moving through urban terrain that channeled their approach, that funneled them into kill zones any competent defender would have anticipated. Kestrel could see the entire tactical picture from above, could see how the ambush had been designed to draw in reinforcements, could see additional fighting positions in adjacent compounds that hadn't yet opened fire, but with the moment more targets presented themselves. Her hand moved to the radio transmit switch. Hound 4-2 actual, Hog 4-1. You're walking into a prepared ambush. I'm observing additional positions. Hog 4-1, stay off this net unless you're cleared to engage. Ashiro's voice was sharp with command authority, and with something else, the anger of a leader whose plan was disintegrating and who needed someone to blame. Another burst of fire erupted from compound Hotel Echo, and a third soldier from Chen's team went down. The technical weapon had traversed to cover the gate, its heavy machine gun creating an impassable barrier of lead that kept Chen's remaining soldiers pinned behind whatever minimal cover the courtyard provided. From Kestrel's position, the tactical geometry was brutally clear. The soldiers were trapped in a killing zone, taking fire from 3 directions, with their only exit route covered by a weapon that could cut through their body armor like tissue paper. The 2 downed soldiers weren't moving, and the harsh mathematics of combat medicine said that every minute they went without treatment reduced their survival probability. Chen was making decisions in microseconds, trying to organize suppressive fire with the soldiers he had left while calling for support that was moving too slowly through urban terrain that the defenders had prepared for exactly this scenario. First squad had reached a position 2 compounds away from Hotel Echo, but the additional firing positions Kestrel had spotted had opened up now, engaging with automatic weapons that forced Kowalski's team to take cover. Second squad was similarly pinned, caught in a crossfire that showed coordination and planning. This wasn't a handful of ISIS remnants protecting a weapons cache. This was a well-executed ambush by people who understood infantry tactics, who'd studied how American forces operated, who'd built this trap specifically to inflict maximum casualties. The radio traffic had degraded into overlapping transmissions, squad leaders calling for support, soldiers calling out enemy positions, Ashiro trying to maintain command and control over a situation that was spiraling beyond his immediate grasp. The communication discipline that had been perfect during the approach had fractured under the stress of troops in contact, of casualties taken, of plans disintegrating into chaos. Kestrel had already made her decision. The regulations were clear about what constituted authority to engage, about the chain of command, about the consequences of unauthorized weapons release. But the regulations had been written by people who weren't watching American soldiers die in real time, who weren't 12,000 feet above a situation where seconds meant the difference between wounded and dead, between a tactical setback and a massacre. She'd spent 20 years operating in the gray spaces where rules met reality, where doctrine became suggestions, where the only metric that mattered was whether people went home alive. Her thumb flicked the master arm switch to on, energizing the weapon systems. The targeting pod was already locked on compound Hotel Echo, the infrared laser designating the technical weapon with precise coordinates. Her right hand found the weapon's selector, rotating it to AGM-65 Maverick, selecting the missile mounted on Station 3. The seeker head activated, its imaging infrared sensor painting a picture on her multifunction display that showed the technical weapon in crisp detail, the heat signature of its engine, and the warm metal of its recently fired gun, creating a target profile that the missile's guidance system recognized and locked. Hound 4-2 actual, Hog 4-1 is engaging Compound Hotel Echo with precision munitions, danger close, she transmitted, not asking permission, informing of intent. All elements take cover 30 seconds. Negative, Hog 4-1. You are not cleared. Ashiro's protest was cut off as Kestrel pressed the pickle button. The Maverick dropped from its pylon with a chunk of released weight, falling for a fraction of a second before its rocket motor ignited with a white-hot flare visible even in daylight. The AGM-65 Maverick accelerated to 600 miles per hour in seconds, its imaging infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of the technical weapon with single-minded determination. From release to impact took 11 seconds, time that stretched with the elastic quality of moments before irreversible consequences. Kestrel tracked the missile's flight path on her display, watching the weapon arc downward in a trajectory calculated to strike from optimal angle, to maximize penetration and fragmentation, to deliver 65 pounds of blast fragmentation, warhead exactly where its guidance system determined the center of the target mass resided. The explosion transformed Compound Hotel Echo into a blooming flower of flame and debris. The technical weapon disintegrated in the initial blast, its ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that added to the destruction. The mud brick walls of the compound absorbed some of the overpressure, channeling the blast upward rather than outward, but the concussive wave still swept across the courtyard with enough force to knock down anyone standing. Dust and smoke billowed skyward, creating a column that would be visible for miles, that marked this spot on the landscape as a place where violence had occurred, where the clinical language of precision munitions translated into shattered concrete and scorched earth. Chen's voice on the radio came through between coughing breaths. Hotel Echo neutralized, technical destroyed. We're extracting casualties. Kestrel banked her A-10, coming around for another pass, her targeting pod already scanning for additional threats. The firing positions that had pinned first and second squads had gone silent, their occupants either killed in the blast or choosing to withdraw rather than face what had just demonstrated American air power's ability to reach out and erase problems. The tactical situation had shifted completely in those 11 seconds, turned from potential disaster into manageable crisis, from soldiers trapped and dying to soldiers moving and fighting. But the radio transmission she'd been expecting came through with the cold fury of command authority exercised. Hog 4-1, Hound 4-2 actual. You were explicitly ordered not to engage. You violated direct orders. Return to base immediately. Kestrel keyed her mic, her voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Hound 4-2 actual, Hog 4-1. I observed American soldiers in immediate danger, assessed that ground element could not effectively neutralize the threat, and exercised my authority as on-scene commander for air assets to prevent further casualties. 2 of your soldiers are down and require immediate casualty evacuation. I recommend you focus on that rather than command disputes. I'll remain on station until medevac is complete. The silence that followed was colder than her words. First Squad had broken through to Compound Hotel Echo now, Kowalski's team providing security while Chen's soldiers carried their wounded toward the extraction point. Kestrel could see it all from above, the medics working on the casualties, the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd trained for this worst-case scenario, the way they moved with urgency but not panic because panic got people killed. One casualty was moving under his own power now, assisted by a squad mate, suggesting his wounds were serious but not immediately life-threatening. The other remained motionless, being carried by two soldiers who moved with the desperate speed that said time was running out. She orbited overhead, maintaining station, her weapons system still active in case additional threats emerged. The village had gone completely silent now, civilians and any remaining hostiles having withdrawn into whatever spaces offered protection from an aircraft that had just demonstrated its lethality. Her fuel gauge showed she had 2 hours remaining on station, more than enough to cover the extraction and provide security for the medevac helicopters that were already being scrambled from FOB Sentinel. The radio crackled with coordination traffic between Hound 42 and the Quick Reaction Force being organized back at base. A pair of US-60 Black Hawks would arrive in 30 minutes, escorted by Apache gunships that would provide additional security. The casualties would be evacuated to the base hospital, then transferred to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany if their injuries required more advanced care. The efficient machine of military medicine would take over, would do everything possible to save lives, would generate paperwork that documented wounds and treatments and outcomes in clinical language that never captured what it meant to bleed on foreign soil. Kestrel's hands remained steady on the stick and throttles, but something cold had settled in her chest. She'd saved lives today, had prevented what would have been a catastrophic outcome, had done exactly what close air support was meant to do. But she'd also done it by violating direct orders from the ground commander, had exercised judgment that contradicted his authority, had demonstrated in the most public way possible that she didn't trust his decision-making. The military ran on command structure, on the understanding that orders were followed even when subordinates disagreed, on the principle that unity of command prevented chaos. What she'd done was technically justified under the immediate threat exception, the clause that allowed on-scene commanders to act when American lives were in imminent danger. But technically justified and career survivable weren't the same thing. The US-60s appeared on her radar screen before she could see them visually. Two contacts inbound from the northwest at low altitude, flying nap of the Earth to avoid potential air defense threats. She called out their approach to Hound 42, confirming the landing zone Chen's team had established in the village square, the space where soldiers were now clearing debris and providing security. The Black Hawks flared over the village with rotor wash that kicked up blinding clouds of dust, settling onto makeshift landing spots with the practiced precision of crews who'd done this too many times. Loading casualties took 4 minutes, the wounded being carried aboard and secured, while the medevac crews began immediate treatment. Kestrel maintained her orbit, watching for any threats, her targeting pod scanning roof lines and windows for muzzle flashes that would indicate someone was stupid enough to engage during a casualty evacuation. But the village remained still, the violence having burned itself out, leaving only the aftermath. The Black Hawks lifted off with casualties secure, climbing rapidly while their Apache escorts positioned themselves to provide covering fire if needed. Kestrel watched them disappear westward, two soldiers who'd been walking point an hour ago now fighting for their lives in ways that had nothing to do with enemy action. Hog 4-1, Hound 4-2 actual. Ashiro's voice carried no warmth despite what had just been accomplished. You are released from station. Return to base and report to operations immediately upon landing. The flight back to FOB Sentinel took 20 minutes, 20 minutes where Kestrel had nothing to do but think about what came next. The A-10 handled with its characteristic stability, requiring minimal input to maintain course and altitude, leaving her mind free to run through scenarios. Best case, she'd face an official reprimand for violating orders, maybe a formal counseling session that would go in her record but wouldn't derail her career. Worst case, Ashiro would push for an Article 15 non-judicial punishment that could mean loss of rank or pay, that would effectively end her prospects for advancement. The middle ground was probably what would happen: an investigation, a formal inquiry into her decision-making, testimony from everyone involved, and eventually a determination that her actions were justified but inappropriate, that she should have found another way. The problem was there hadn't been another way. Chen's squad would have been destroyed if she'd waited for proper authorization, if she'd let the command chain work through its process while soldiers died in a courtyard. The mathematics were brutal but clear. She'd saved lives by acting, had prevented casualties by violating protocol. Any investigation would have to grapple with that calculus, would have to weigh rules against results, doctrine against reality. Fob Sentinel appeared on the horizon, its geometric patterns resolving into runways and taxiways and rows of containerized housing units. She called for landing clearance, received it from a tower controller who sounded professionally neutral, began her approach with the careful attention that landing a 23-ton aircraft always required. The runway rushed up to meet her, and she touched down with only a slight chirp of main gear contact. Good landing by any standard. Torres was waiting at her parking spot, his ground crew ready to secure the aircraft, his face carefully blank as she climbed down from the cockpit. "How'd it go?" he asked, the question formulaic expected. "It went," Kestrel replied, pulling off her helmet. His eyes shifted toward the operations tent. "Captain Renner wants to see you, immediately." She'd expected that. She nodded, handed over her helmet and harness to the crew chief, and started walking across the flight line. Behind her, Torres and his crew began their post-flight inspection, checking weapons stations and control surfaces, looking for battle damage that wasn't there because the enemy never got a shot at her. The morning heat had built to its full strength now, the sun hammering down with the kind of intensity that made movement exhausting, that made the walk to operations feel longer than its actual 200 meters. Soldiers watched her pass, their conversations stopping, their attention following her progress. Word had already spread somehow, the informal communication network that every military unit possessed operating at its usual impossible speed. They knew something had happened, knew there'd been contact, knew casualties had been taken. What they didn't know yet was what role she'd played, whether she was hero or problem, whether the woman who'd been underestimated 2 days ago had proven herself or validated every doubt. Kestrel reached the operations tent and pushed through the entrance. Captain Renner sat behind his improvised desk with the kind of rigid posture that said he'd been waiting for this moment, had been preparing for this conversation, had probably already drafted multiple versions of the ass-chewing he was about to deliver. Lieutenant Ashiro stood to his right, his face flushed with anger that hadn't cooled during his own return to base. 2 other officers Kestrel didn't recognize occupied chairs against the tent wall, observers or witnesses to whatever was about to happen. The tactical displays had been paused, frozen on the map showing Compound Hotel Echo and the positions where Hound Fortu had made contact. Someone had marked the location of her missile impact with a red circle that looked like an accusation. Renner gestured to the empty space in front of his desk. "Stand at ease, Lieutenant Commander. We have some things to discuss." Kestrel assumed the position, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind her back, eyes forward. The tent was quiet except for the cooling fans and the distant sound of helicopters on approach. Ashiro stared at her with unconcealed hostility, his jaw muscles working like he was chewing through every word he wanted to say but couldn't in front of a superior officer. "Walk me through your decision-making," Renner said, his voice carefully neutral. "Start with when you first observed hostile activity at Compound Hotel Echo." This was the formal part, the official questioning that would be documented and filed, that might be used in disciplinary proceedings or might be used to protect her. Kestrel chose her words with precision, keeping her tone factual, avoiding any hint of defensiveness or justification. She described her initial observation of suspicious activity, her report to Ashiro, her continued monitoring as the situation developed. She detailed the moment when Chen's squad was ambushed, the tactical assessment she'd made about their survivability, the calculation that led to her weapon's release. And when Lieutenant Ashiro ordered you to stay off the net unless cleared to engage, Renner asked. I assessed that American soldiers were in immediate danger, that ground forces could not effectively neutralize the threat, and that delay would result in additional casualties. I exercised my authority as on-scene air commander under the immediate threat exception to rules of engagement. Ashiro made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disgust. You violated direct orders. You ignored my command authority. You made yourself the decision-maker for a ground operation you weren't part of. Kestrel turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression unchanged. Your squad was dying. The technical weapon had them pinned with no effective counter. Every second of delay increased the casualty count. I made the call that needed to be made. That wasn't your call to make. Ashiro's voice had risen, his professional composure cracking. I'm the ground commander. I determine when and how air support is employed. You don't get to second-guess my tactical decisions because you think you know better. I don't think I know better, Kestrel said quietly. I know better. 20 years of operational experience, most of it on the ground where you're operating now. I've been where your soldiers were today. I know what it looks like when a situation is about to go from bad to catastrophic. And I know that pride isn't worth body bags. The silence that followed her words was absolute, the kind of quiet where even the cooling fan seemed to pause. Renner leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled again in the gesture Kestrel was beginning to recognize as his thinking pose. The two observers against the wall had shifted, their body language suggesting they were reevaluating whatever assumptions they'd brought into this tent. Ashiro's face had gone from flushed to pale, the implications of her words landing with their full weight. She just accused him of letting pride override tactical necessity, of being willing to sacrifice his soldiers rather than accept guidance from someone he didn't respect. It was a brutal assessment, delivered without heat, but with the kind of certainty that came from having been there, from having made harder calls in worse situations. 20 years, Renner said finally, his voice thoughtful. DVGRU. That's what your redacted service record doesn't say explicitly but implies loudly enough if you know how to read between the classifications. He glanced at Ashiro. Were you aware that Lieutenant Commander Thorne operated with SEAL Team 6 before transitioning to aviation? Ashiro's expression suggested he had not been aware, that this information was landing like an artillery round in the middle of his righteous anger. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. I didn't. Why wasn't this in the briefing materials? Because it's classified at a level you don't have access to, Renner replied. Because her service record is compartmented for reasons that have nothing to do with current operations. Because the Navy doesn't advertise who operates in its most sensitive units. He turned his attention back to Kestrel. But that classified experience is exactly why you made the call you made today, isn't it? You've been on the receiving end of close air support. You know what it looks like when the support doesn't come in time. Kestrel nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement. Renner pulled a folder from his desk, opened it to reveal after-action photos that must have been transmitted from Hound 42's helmet cameras. The images showed Compound Hotel Echo after the missile strike, the destroyed technical weapon, the blast damage that had neutralized the ambush. He pushed the folder across the desk toward Ashiro. Look at those photos, Lieutenant. That technical weapon would have killed or wounded every soldier in Staff Sergeant Chen's squad. The secondary explosions from its ammunition cooking off would have spread shrapnel across the entire courtyard. Your two casualties would have been 7 or 8, maybe more when 1st and 2nd squads got drawn into the kill zone. Renner's voice remained level, but something hard had entered his tone. Lieutenant Commander Thorne made a judgment call based on 2 decades of experience that told her your people were about to die. She violated protocol to save them. Now we have to decide whether that violation was justified. One of the observers against the wall spoke for the first time, a major whose name tape read Patterson. The rules of engagement are clear. On-scene commanders have authority to engage when American forces face imminent threat, and no time exists for standard approval process. The question isn't whether she had legal authority. The question is whether her assessment of imminent threat was accurate. Chen's squad was pinned by a heavy machine gun in a prepared ambush, Kestrel said. They had 2 casualties down, were taking fire from 3 directions, and had no ability to maneuver. That's the definition of imminent threat. Patterson nodded slowly. I agree, which means this comes down to chain of command and unit cohesion. Lieutenant Oshiro, do you believe Lieutenant Commander Thorne acted with malicious intent? Do you believe she ignored your orders out of disrespect for your authority? Oshiro looked at the photos again, his jaw working. The tent had gone quiet except for the eternal cooling fans. Finally, he shook his head. No, I think she acted because she believed my soldiers were going to die. I think she was probably right about that. The admission seemed to cost him something, his shoulders sagging slightly. But I also think she should have found a way to work within command structure. There wasn't time, Kestrel said. You know that, we both know that. Renner closed the folder. Renner stood, his chair scraping against the plywood floor, the sound harsh in the quiet tent. He moved to the tactical display, staring at the frozen map showing Compound Hotel Echo, the red circle marking where Kestrel's missile had impacted, the blue icons representing soldiers who were alive because of split-second judgment made 12,000 feet above chaos. His hand traced the positions where 1st and 2nd squads had been pinned, where the additional firing positions had been waiting to spring the full extent of the ambush. The tactical geometry told its own story if you knew how to read it, showed how close Hound Fortu had come to a disaster that would have made headlines, that would have been analyzed in staff colleges, that would have added more names to walls that held too many already. I'm not going to pursue formal disciplinary action, Renner said finally, still looking at the map rather than at Kestrel or Oshiro. The immediate threat exception covers Lieutenant Commander Thorne's actions, and the outcome supports her assessment. But this situation is a symptom of a larger problem we've been ignoring. He turned now, his eyes moving between the 2 officers. We have a pilot with 2 decades of special operations experience, the kind of ground perspective that should make her the most valuable close air support asset on this base. Instead, she's being treated like a liability because some soldiers decided she doesn't belong before giving her a chance to prove otherwise. Oshiro shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. The changing room incident 2 days ago, Renner continued. I know what really happened there. I know what Staff Sergeant Vance and his people were trying to do, and I know how Lieutenant Commander Thorne responded. I didn't have enough evidence to pursue charges, but I'm not blind to the culture that led to that confrontation. His voice hardened. That culture nearly got your soldiers killed today, Lieutenant Oshiro. Because you didn't trust your air support's judgment. Because you were too proud to accept tactical guidance from someone you'd already written off. You made decisions that put your people in greater danger. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Kestrel remained at attention, her face impassive, but she felt something shift in the tense atmosphere. Renner wasn't just addressing the immediate incident. He was attacking the underlying rot, the institutional assumptions that valued conformity over competence, that measured capability by familiar patterns rather than actual performance. Sir, Oshiro said carefully, I take full responsibility for my tactical decisions. But asking me to trust a pilot I've never worked with, who everyone says is past her prime, who just saved your squad from being massacred, Renner interrupted. Let me tell you something about Lieutenant Commander Thorne's service record, the parts that aren't redacted. She has more combat experience than everyone in this tent combined. She's been decorated 3 times for valor under fire, has carried wounded teammates through enemy territory, has made calls under pressure that most of us couldn't imagine having to make. The Navy didn't transition her to aviation because she was getting old. They transitioned her because, after 20 years of direct action, she wanted to provide the kind of support she used to depend on, because she understands intimately what it means to be the person on the ground calling for help. Major Patterson spoke again from his position against the wall. Captain Renner is correct. I've been reviewing Lieutenant Commander Thorne's service record. The portions I have clearance for in her tactical assessment today was textbook correct. Not just justified, but correct. She saw the ambush developing before ground forces could perceive it from their limited perspective. She recognized the threat timeline and acted within the narrow window available. He paused. The real question is how we prevent this situation from recurring. How do we integrate an asset with her capabilities effectively? Renner nodded. That's exactly the question. The tent flap opened, and Staff Sergeant Chen entered, still wearing his combat gear, dust and dried blood on his uniform. He came to attention, his face showing the exhaustion that came after adrenaline faded and body acknowledged what spirit had pushed through. Renner waved him to ease. Staff Sergeant, you were in Compound Hotel Echo when Lieutenant Commander Thorne engaged. I want your assessment of whether her actions were necessary. Chen's eyes found Kestrel, held her gaze for a moment, then shifted back to Renner. Sir, that technical weapon was chewing us apart. We had 2 men down, no effective cover, and we were taking fire from positions we couldn't suppress with what we had. Another 30 seconds and we'd have lost everyone in that courtyard. His voice was flat, factual, but something moved behind his eyes. I've been in combat for 4 tours. I know what it feels like when you're about to die. We were there. Whatever authority issues Lieutenant Commander Thorne violated, she kept my soldiers alive. That's the only metric that matters from where I'm standing. Ashiro's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of an officer receiving information that contradicted his previous position, but who was professional enough not to argue with his NCO's combat assessment. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, Renner said. How are your wounded? Martinez took a round through the shoulder, clean through, probably keep him offline for 6 weeks, but full recovery expected. Williams. Chen's jaw tightened. Williams took shrapnel to the chest and abdomen. They're working on him in surgery now. Touch and go. The tent went quiet. Williams, a name that had been just a blue icon on a tactical display, was now a specific human being fighting for his life because of decisions made and not made, because of ambushes sprung and missiles fired, because of all the chaos that reduced down to whether one soldier would go home to whatever life waited for him or would instead become a statistic, a casualty report, a name on a memorial wall. Dismissed, Staff Sergeant, Renner said gently. Get some rest. Chen saluted, turned to leave, but paused at the tent entrance. He looked back at Kestrel. Ma'am, whatever they say about what you did today, my squad knows. We know. Then he was gone. The weight of those words settled over everyone remaining. Renner returned to his desk, sat down with the careful deliberation of a man who'd made a decision and was now going to implement it regardless of resistance. He pulled out a notebook, began writing with quick, decisive strokes. Lieutenant Ashiro, you're going to work with Lieutenant Commander Thorne on establishing integration procedures between air support and ground operations. I want protocols developed that leverage her experience, that create communication channels between pilots and platoon leaders, that prevent the kind of disconnect we saw today. Ashiro stiffened. Sir, with respect. That wasn't a request, Lieutenant. It was an order. Renner's tone allowed no debate. Your platoon is going back out in 3 days for another operation. You're going to have the same air support, and you're going to trust her judgment because her judgment is what kept your soldiers alive today when yours nearly got them killed. The brutality of that assessment made Ashiro flinch, but he didn't argue. He nodded stiffly, his professional discipline overriding whatever personal feelings churned beneath. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, Renner continued, you're going to teach a class for all ground commanders on this base about what close air support can and cannot do, about how to work effectively with aircraft overhead, about what information pilots need to make good decisions. You're going to share your experience from the ground side, help these young officers understand the perspective you bring. Kestrel nodded, yes, sir. Major Patterson will oversee the development of these integration procedures. I want formal recommendations within 5 days. Renner looked at each person in turn. We're fighting an enemy that doesn't care about our internal problems, our personality conflicts, our pride. They care about killing Americans, and they're good at it. So we're going to be better. We're going to use every advantage we have, including the 2 decades of hard-won experience standing in this tent. Are we clear? A chorus of acknowledgments followed, each voice carrying different levels of enthusiasm, but all containing the obedience that military command structure required. The meeting broke up, officers filing out into sunlight that felt harsh after the tent's dimness. Ashira walked past Kestrel without speaking, his body language stiff with suppressed emotion, his face showing the kind of internal struggle that came from having your competence questioned by someone you dismissed. Major Patterson paused beside her, extending his hand. "That was good work today, Commander," he said quietly. "Not easy, but good." She shook his hand, appreciating the acknowledgement from someone who outranked everyone else in that tent. Patterson had credibility that came from rank, and from the combat patch on his shoulder showing deployment with the 82nd Airborne during heavy fighting in Iraq. His opinion would carry weight with the junior officers, would help shift the narrative about what had happened. Torres was still working on her A-10 when Kestrel returned to the flight line, his crew performing the kind of detailed post-flight inspection that maintenance chiefs lived for. He straightened as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been clean once, but was now decorated with hydraulic fluid and general aviation grime. His expression had shifted from the hostile neutrality of earlier to something more complex, something that looked like reevaluation in progress. "Heard what happened out there," he said. "Heard you put a Maverick through a technical weapon that was about to smoke an entire squad." Kestrel nodded, not sure where this conversation was going. "Also heard you got jammed up for violating orders." Torres glanced at the operations tent, then back at her. "Want to know what I think?" "Sure." "I think I was an asshole 2 days ago. I think I made assumptions about you based on nothing but what other people were saying, based on seeing a woman with some gray hair and deciding that meant you were soft, that you didn't have what it takes." He folded the rag, unfolded it, a nervous gesture that showed discomfort with what he was saying. "My brother flew Apache in Afghanistan. Got shot down in Helmand Province. Survived because a Warthog pilot stayed on station through a shitstorm and kept the Taliban off him until rescue arrived. That pilot didn't care about anything except keeping an American alive. Didn't matter if it was doctrine or proper procedure. Just mattered that someone needed help." "Torres." "Let me finish, ma'am." He met her eyes. "You did today what my brother's pilot did for him. You saw soldiers who were going to die and you made it not happen. Whatever the brass says about it, whatever comes down through channels, that's the job. That's what close air support means. And I should have recognized that before judging you based on nothing but surface-level bullshit." Kestrel felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "Apology accepted, and thank you. Your aircraft's clean, ma'am. No battle damage, all systems green. She's ready to fly whenever you need her." He paused. "And for what it's worth, I'll make sure the rest of my crew knows what really happened today. The story that needs to be told." Torres walked away before she could respond, leaving Kestrel alone on the flight line with her A-10 and the afternoon sun beating down like judgment. She ran her hand along the fuselage again, feeling the warmth of metal that had absorbed hours of solar heating, tracing the panel lines and rivets that held this machine together. The aircraft had performed exactly as designed, had delivered ordnance precisely where she'd aimed it, had given her the capability to reach out across miles and end a threat. But the machine was just a tool. The decisions, the judgment, the weight of lives saved and lives ended, that all lived in the human behind the controls. Her radio, still clipped to her vest, crackled with traffic from ongoing operations. Other missions, other soldiers, other pilots working through their own challenges. The war continued, indifferent to individual stories, grinding forward with the momentum of historical forces too large for any single person to affect. But in the spaces between the grinding, in moments like today, individuals made differences. Decisions mattered. Experience counted. And sometimes, violating protocol was the most moral choice available. Kestrel walked across the flight line toward her quarters, past soldiers who now watched her with different expressions, past aircraft that represented American air power, past all the infrastructure of war that had been built and would be dismantled when national interest shifted elsewhere. She was thinking about Williams, the soldier still in surgery, whose survival depended on the skill of doctors and the resilience of his body and the brutal randomness of where shrapnel traveled. She was thinking about Chen's words, about his squad knowing what she'd done, about how that knowledge would spread through informal networks faster than any official report. She was thinking about Ashiro's face when Renner had called out his pride, about the learning that would have to happen, about whether that learning would stick or would fade once the immediate crisis passed. The sun was setting over Fob Sentinel, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep purple. Somewhere in the distance, the call to evening prayer drifted across from nearby villages, the melodic chanting reminding everyone that this land had been here long before bases and operations, would be here long after. Kestrel paused at her quarters entrance, looked back at the flight line where her A-10 sat waiting for the next mission, and wondered if she'd made the right choice coming here, transitioning from DEVGRU to aviation, trying to continue serving when maybe it would have been easier to retire into civilian life, where decisions didn't carry life and death weight. But she knew the answer. This was who she was. This was what she'd trained for, fought for, sacrificed for across 20 years of service, and if today was any indication, there was still work to do. Inside her quarters, sparse and functional, she finally allowed herself to sit down. The exhaustion hit all at once, the accumulated stress of the day releasing now that she was alone. She'd been running on adrenaline and training since the moment Chen's squad had been ambushed, had maintained professional composure through Renner's interrogation and Tor's apology, and all the other moments that required strength. Now in privacy, she could let her hands shake slightly with delayed reaction, could feel the weight of what she'd done settle onto her shoulders. She'd killed people today. The missile strike had almost certainly ended lives, had turned human beings into casualties, had taken fathers or sons or brothers from families who would grieve them. That was the truth beneath the clinical language of targets neutralized and threats eliminated. Real people had died because she made a decision. But other real people were alive because of the same decision. Martinez would heal from his shoulder wound, would probably carry a scar and a story but would go home eventually. Williams might survive surgery, might fight his way back to health, might get to see his family again instead of coming home in a flag-draped box. Chen's entire squad had a tomorrow because she'd acted. The mathematics were brutal. Lives saved versus lives taken. The moral calculus that soldiers and pilots lived with, that commanders wrestled with, that never got easier no matter how many times you performed the calculation. A knock at her door interrupted the spiral of thoughts. She stood, opened it to find Major Patterson standing outside, his uniform still crisp despite the day's heat. "Mind if I come in, Commander?" She stepped aside, gestured to the room's only chair while she remained standing. Patterson sat with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with his authority, his eyes scanning the sparse quarters with professional assessment. A bunk, a footlocker, a small desk with a laptop that held personal correspondence and the mundane administration of military life. Nothing decorative, nothing that suggested permanence. A space inhabited rather than lived in. "I wanted to talk to you away from the formal chain of command," Patterson began. "What I'm about to say doesn't go in any report, doesn't get repeated. Understood?" Understood, sir. You made enemies today, not because you were wrong, you weren't, but because you embarrassed junior officers in front of their peers, highlighted institutional problems that people would rather ignore, and demonstrated competence that made others look inadequate by comparison. Patterson's voice was matter of fact, neither sympathetic nor critical. Ashiro will probably come around once his pride heals, but Vance and his friends, they're the real problem. They represent a culture that sees you as threat rather than asset, and culture doesn't change quickly. Kestrel nodded. She'd known this, had lived through versions of it before in DEVGRU during the years when women weren't officially supposed to be in combat roles, but were operating anyway under different paperwork. The resentment had been palpable then too, from men who felt their exclusive status threatened, who measured their identity against who was excluded rather than who was included. The question is what you do about it, Patterson continued. You can try to win them over through continued competence, prove yourself repeatedly until even the doubters acknowledge your capability. Or you can accept that some people will never change their minds, focus on the ones who matter, and do your job regardless of approval. He paused. There's no right answer. Both approaches have costs. What would you recommend, sir? Patterson smiled slightly. I'd recommend you keep doing exactly what you did today. Make the hard calls when they need making. Trust your experience even when others question it. And understand that the soldiers whose lives you save will remember, will spread the word, will build your reputation in ways that official channels never could. Chen already knows. His squad knows. That'll spread through Bravo Company, then throughout the battalion. Give it time. And the investigation into the changing room incident. Dead in the water. Renner won't push it, not after today proved every assumption wrong, but that doesn't mean Vance forgets. Watch your back, Commander. Men like him don't handle humiliation well. Patterson stood, moved toward the door, then turned back. One more thing. Williams made it through surgery. They're listing him as stable. He'll need months of recovery, but he's going to live. The relief that flooded through Kestrel was physical, almost overwhelming. One more soldier going home, one more family not receiving the worst news, one more life that continued because of split-second judgment and missile guidance systems, and the entire infrastructure that supported combat operations. Thank you for telling me, sir. Thank you for saving him. Patterson's hand was on the door handle. Get some rest, Commander. Tomorrow starts all over again. He left, and Kestrel was alone with the fading daylight and the knowledge that Williams would survive. She sat on her bunk, leaning back against the wall, letting her eyes close. Tomorrow would indeed start over, would bring new missions and new challenges and probably new conflicts with people who decided she was the problem rather than the solution. But tonight, one soldier was alive who might have been dead. Tonight, that was enough. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless. Morning formation at FOB Sentinel occurred at 6:30 hours, the entire base personnel gathering in ranks while the sun climbed above the horizon and turned the sky from gray to gold. Kestrel stood with the other pilots, her flight suit pressed and her boots polished, presenting the professional image that military culture demanded regardless of how little sleep you'd gotten or how much your body ached from tension held too long. The base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hastings, stood at the formation's front, a career officer whose deployment history included multiple combat tours and whose bearing suggested competence earned through experience rather than just time in service. Yesterday, several members of Hound Fortu were wounded during operations in the Euphrates Valley. Hastings began, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. Through the combined efforts of ground forces and air support, casualties were limited and all personnel were successfully evacuated. I want to specifically recognize Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Thorne for her actions during this engagement. Kestrel felt eyes turned toward her, felt the weight of attention from hundreds of soldiers and airmen. She kept her gaze fixed forward, her face neutral. Commander Thorne engaged hostile forces with precision munitions under danger-close conditions, neutralizing a technical weapon that posed an immediate threat to American personnel. Her tactical judgment, gained through extensive prior service that most of you are not cleared to know about, prevented what could have been a significant loss of life. Hastings paused, letting the words settle. This is what integrated operations look like when done correctly. This is what trusting your fellow service members' expertise accomplishes. And this is the standard I expect from everyone on this base going forward. The formation ended with the usual administrative announcements, and soldiers dispersed to their duty sections. But as Kestrel walked toward the operations tent for the day's mission brief, soldiers she'd never spoken to nodded in her direction, offered quiet words of thanks, acknowledged her in ways that hadn't happened before. The informal network Patterson had mentioned was already operating, spreading the story of what had happened in Compound Hotel Echo, creating a narrative that countered the earlier assumptions and doubts. In the operations tent, Ashiro was waiting. His posture was less hostile than the previous day, though not quite friendly. Professional, maybe, willing to work with rather than against. Progress, even if minimal. "Commander," he said, the greeting careful. "Captain Renner wants us to start developing those integration procedures he ordered. I thought we could begin by you walking me through how you assess threats from altitude, what information you need from ground forces to make targeting decisions." It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening, an acknowledgement that he had things to learn from her experience. Kestrel nodded, moved to the tactical display, began explaining the geometry of close air support, the sight picture from 12,000 feet, the indicators that separated civilians from combatants, the timing calculations that determined when to engage. Ashiro listened, asked intelligent questions, gradually shifted from defensive to engaged as he recognized the depth of knowledge being shared. They worked through the morning, building frameworks for communication, establishing protocols for different threat scenarios, creating the kind of integrated doctrine that should have existed before, but hadn't because institutional inertia and cultural resistance had prevented it. Other officers filtered in and out, some listening to the discussion, some contributing their own experiences, gradually building towards something that resembled team cohesion. Around midday, Torres appeared at the tent entrance, gestured for Kestrel's attention. She excused herself from the planning session, followed him outside into heat that had built to its daily peak. He led her toward the flight line, where her A-10 sat with something new painted on its fuselage just below the canopy. Fresh artwork, applied with the skill that suggested Torres or one of his crew had talent beyond aircraft maintenance. The image showed an A-10 diving through stylized clouds, weapons bay doors open, a missile in flight. Above it, in precise lettering, Kestrel. Below it, a tally of mission symbols, including one larger symbol marked with yesterday's date. A kill marking, officially against regulations but unofficially tolerated, acknowledging the technical weapon destroyed and the lives saved. "Figured she deserved a name," Torres said. "And figured you deserved recognition for what you did. If the brass has a problem with it, they can take it up with me." Kestrel stared at the artwork, feeling something catch in her throat. The name, her call sign, permanently marked on the aircraft that had become her tool and her weapon and her responsibility. Personal in ways that military equipment wasn't supposed to be personal, that regulations discouraged because attachment could cloud judgment. But also meaningful, a statement that she belonged here, that this aircraft was hers in ways that transcended paperwork and assignment orders. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me, ma'am. Just keep doing what you did yesterday. Keep bringing our people home." Torres gestured at the mission symbol. "That'll fill up with more marks before this deployment's done. Every one of them will mean soldiers who got to keep living because you were overhead when they needed you." She ran her hand over the painted letters of her name, feeling the slight texture where paint met metal. Kestrel, the small falcon that hunted with precision and patience, that could hover in place while scanning for targets, that struck with decisive speed when the moment came. The call sign had been given to her years ago in DEVGRU, earned through operations where her ability to maintain position and wait for exactly the right moment had saved missions and lives. Now it marked this aircraft, connected her past to her present, bound her identity to this machine that would carry her through whatever came next. The 3 days before Hound 42's next operation passed in a blur of training and planning. Kestrel spent hours with Ashiro and his squad leaders, running through scenarios, practicing radio communications, building the trust that came from understanding rather than hopping. They used the tactical display to replay her engagement of Compound Hotel Echo, walking through each decision point, discussing alternative approaches, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. The junior officers gradually relaxed as they recognized that she wasn't criticizing their tactics so much as teaching them how to leverage air support more effectively. She also taught the class Renner had ordered, standing before every ground commander on the base and explaining close air support from both perspectives, what she could see from altitude, what she needed to hear from ground forces, what information mattered and what was just noise. She described her DEVGRU experience, the operations where she'd been the one calling for air support, the perspective that shaped how she thought about every mission. The officers listened, took notes, asked questions that suggested they were genuinely trying to learn rather than just checking a compliance box. Williams remained in stable condition, evacuated to Landstuhl as expected. Reports filtered back that his prognosis was good, that he'd require multiple surgeries but would eventually recover full function. Chen visited Kestrel's quarters one evening to deliver the news personally, his face showing the kind of relief that came from not having to write letters to a family explaining how their son or husband or father had died on foreign soil. "He wants to meet you when he's recovered enough," Chen said. "Wants to thank you personally." "He doesn't owe me anything," Kestrel replied. "He was doing his job, I was doing mine." Maybe, but his wife sent a message through the family support chain, said she wants to thank the pilot who kept her husband alive, so whether you think gratitude is owed or not, you're going to receive it. Chen smiled slightly. "Better get used to it, ma'am. Words spread about who you really are, what you did before aviation. You're becoming something of a legend around here." Kestrel didn't want to be a legend. Legends were burdens, expectations that could never be met, reputations that created pressure to live up to narratives others constructed. She wanted to be competent, reliable, trusted. But she understood that how others perceived her was beyond her control, that the stories would spread regardless of her preferences, that the mythology would build from the facts whether she participated or not. On the evening before the next operation, Vance approached her in the dining facility. The DFAC was crowded with soldiers eating dinner before night operations, the noise level high enough that private conversations were possible despite proximity to dozens of people. Vance's two corporals weren't with him, suggesting this was something he needed to do alone. His expression was difficult to read, not hostile but not friendly either. "Commander," he said, standing at the position of attention that military courtesy required when addressing superior officers. "Staff Sergeant," Kestrel replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. He sat uncomfortable in ways that showed in his posture. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at his hands on the table. Finally, "I was wrong, about you, about what happened in the changing room, about a lot of things." The words came out stiffly, like they hurt to say. "I heard what you did for Hound 42, heard that you saved Chen's squad when they were about to get wiped out, and I heard about your background, about what you really are." "What I was," Kestrel corrected. "I'm a pilot now." "No, ma'am, with respect, you're still what you were. That doesn't change just because you're flying instead of kicking doors. You're still someone who's been there, done things most of us can't imagine, earned the right to be here." He met her eyes finally. "I judged you based on nothing but assumptions, based on what I thought you should be instead of who you are. That was wrong, and I apologize." The apology was genuine. Kestrel could see that. Vance wasn't the kind of man who apologized easily wasn't comfortable with admitting he'd been wrong. But he was doing it anyway, was pushing through his own discomfort because integrity demanded it. That took a kind of courage different from combat courage, but no less real. Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant. And for what it's worth, I understand why you reacted the way you did. I've been where you are, trying to establish identity in a brotherhood that measures belonging by narrow criteria. It's easier to enforce boundaries than to question whether those boundaries make sense. Maybe, Vance paused. For what it's worth, what you did in that changing room, the way you took us down without really hurting us, without reporting it officially, without trying to end our careers, that was professional. You could have destroyed us. Should have, probably, but you chose not to. I chose to make it a learning experience instead of a disciplinary one. Seems like maybe that was the right call. Yes, ma'am, it was. Vance stood, came to attention again. I'll pass the word to my people. We were wrong, you're the real deal, and anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me. He walked away before she could respond, leaving Kestrel alone with her dinner and the recognition that something had shifted fundamentally in how this base perceived her. The resistance hadn't disappeared entirely. There would always be people who couldn't adapt, who remained committed to their prejudices despite evidence. But the critical mass had tipped, had moved from skepticism to acceptance, from doubt to respect. It was enough. The next morning's brief was different in subtle ways. Ashiro addressed her directly when discussing air support requirements, his questions genuine rather than skeptical. The other officers in the room listened when she offered tactical suggestions, incorporated her guidance into their planning. The mission itself was similar to the previous operation, clearing operations in a different village, searching for weapons caches and ISIS remnants, expecting potential contact. But this time, when Kestrel took off in her A-10 with Kestrel painted on the fuselage, she carried with her the trust of the ground forces she'd be supporting. The flight to station was routine, the morning air calm and clear. She established her orbit over the objective area, began her sensor sweeps, maintained radio contact with Hound 42 as they moved into position. The village below showed normal patterns of civilian life, people beginning their day with the caution that came from living in contested territory. Ashiro's forces entered from multiple directions, their movement coordinated and professional, their communications clear and efficient. For 3 hours the operation proceeded without contact. Buildings were cleared, civilians were questioned, caches were searched. The intelligence had been wrong or outdated, the weapons already moved, the target set having shifted elsewhere. It happened, the frustration of chasing an enemy that adapted faster than planning cycles. But Hound 42 conducted their mission professionally, checked every structure on their list, made the effort worthwhile even if the immediate results were disappointing. As they began their extraction, Ashiro's voice came through with unusual warmth. Hog 41, Hound 42 Actual, appreciate the overwatch today. Good to know you're up there. Copy that, Hound 42, good hunting down there. Hog 41, Hound 42, same time next week. Kestrel smiled despite herself. Same time next week, Hog 41 is RTB. She turned her A-10 toward Fob Sentinel, toward the base that had become familiar, toward the flight line where Torres and his crew would be waiting to service her aircraft, toward quarters that held her gear and the sparse personal effects that traveled with her. Below, the Syrian landscape stretched eternal and indifferent, the same terrain that had watched empires rise and fall, that would outlast all the current conflicts and the players involved. But for now, in this moment, she had a place here. Had earned it through competence and judgment, and the willingness to make hard calls when they needed making. The A-10 flew steadily westward, and Kestrel Thorne flew at home. 6 weeks later, the memorial ceremony for operations conducted during the deployment took place on the Fob Sentinel flight line, the assembled personnel standing in formation, while Lieutenant Colonel Hastings spoke about sacrifice and service, and the missions that had been completed. Martinez stood in formation, his arm still in a sling but healing well, his presence a visible reminder that casualties didn't always mean deaths, that wounded could recover and return. Williams remained in Germany, still undergoing surgeries, but reports indicated he'd eventually make full recovery. The two seats in formation that represented him were empty, but not permanently so, a distinction that mattered more than statistics could capture. Hastings presented awards to soldiers who demonstrated exceptional performance during combat operations. Chen received a Bronze Star for his leadership under fire, his citation specifically mentioning his squad's actions in Compound Hotel Echo. Kowalski and several others received Army Commendation Medals for various acts of competence and courage. The ceremony was brief, professional, acknowledging that awards were tokens rather than compensation, symbols that meant something to those who received them but couldn't capture what had actually been experienced. When Hastings called Kestrel forward, she approached with the measured bearing that 20 years of military service had ingrained. He held a metal case, opened it to reveal the Distinguished Flying Cross, the citation already signed and official. For heroism while participating in aerial flight, Hastings read from the prepared text. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Thorne distinguished herself by extraordinary achievement while serving as an A-10 pilot supporting ground operations in Syria. Her tactical judgment under combat conditions, coupled with her precise weapons delivery in danger-close scenarios, directly prevented the loss of American lives. Her actions exemplify the finest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Naval Service. He pinned the medal to her uniform, shook her hand, and in that moment of physical contact, transmitted something beyond the formal ceremony. Respect, maybe. Recognition that transcended rank. Acknowledgement of what she'd brought to this deployment, to this unit, to the soldiers who'd initially doubted her capability. The formation ended, soldiers dispersed, and Kestrel found herself surrounded by members of Hound Fortu, by pilots from her squadron, by soldiers and airmen who wanted to congratulate her or thank her or simply acknowledge her presence. It was overwhelming in ways combat never was, the social demands of being recognized, of accepting gratitude that felt simultaneously deserved and excessive. She managed it with the same discipline she brought to everything else, said the right words, maintained appropriate bearing, did what was expected. That evening, she sat in her quarters writing a letter to Williams, one of the old-fashioned physical letters that military personnel still wrote, because emails felt insufficient for certain kinds of communication. She told him about the award ceremony, about his squad's continued operations, about the integration procedures that had been developed and implemented. She told him that his recovery was being tracked by people who cared about his return, that his position in the unit was being held for him, that he remained part of the team even while healing thousands of miles away. It was a small gesture, inadequate to the magnitude of what he'd experienced, but it was what she could offer. The deployment continued. More missions followed, routine patrols and complex operations, days where nothing happened and days where contact occurred and air support made the difference. Kestrel flew them all with the same attention to detail, the same commitment to the ground forces depending on her capability. The tally marks on her A-10 increased, each one representing a mission completed, a threat neutralized, a day where soldiers went home alive because she'd been overhead when needed. Oshiro evolved from grudging acceptance to genuine partnership, his tactical planning now incorporating air support as integral component rather than supplementary afterthought. His mission briefs referenced her input. His operations were designed to leverage her capabilities. His trust in her judgment became evident in how he employed her during critical moments. The other pilots began seeking her guidance, asking questions about tactics and techniques, building their own competence through access to her experience. Torres and his maintenance crew kept her A-10 in perfect condition, took pride in the aircraft's reliability and performance, added their own effort to the mission success she achieved in the air. The culture shift at Fob Sentinel was gradual but real. Female soldiers found themselves treated with slightly more respect, their capabilities evaluated based on performance rather than assumptions. The changing room remained a space where people changed clothes, nothing more. The implied threat that had existed there eliminated through demonstrated consequences. It wasn't perfect institutional culture, never changed completely, always retained elements resistant to evolution. But it was better, measurably better, the kind of incremental progress that accumulated over time into meaningful transformation. 3 months into the deployment, Kestrel received orders for her next assignment, instructor pilot position at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where A-10 pilots underwent advanced training before combat deployments. It was a recognition of her capability, an acknowledgement that her experience needed to be transmitted to the next generation, a natural progression for someone at her career stage. She'd accepted the orders, begun making preparations for departure, started saying goodbyes to the people and places that had become familiar. On her final mission, flying support for a platoon she'd never worked with before, the ground commander called up after the operation concluded. "Hog 4-1, this is Gladiator 6. Heard stories about you before we came out today. Wanted to see if they were true. They were. Appreciate the professional support, ma'am. Hope whoever gets you next appreciates what they're getting." Copy that, Gladiator 6. Fair winds and following seas. She brought her A-10 back to Fob Sentinel for the last time, landed on the runway she'd touched down on dozens of times before, taxied to the flight line where tours waited. The crew chief supervised her shutdown, performed his post-flight inspection, then stood back to look at the aircraft that had carried her through the deployment. "She's ready for whoever comes next," Torres said. "But she'll miss you, ma'am. We'll all miss you. Take care of her, and take care of whoever sits in that cockpit next. Make sure they understand what this aircraft can do, what the mission requires." "Will do, Commander." Torres came to attention, rendered a perfect salute that she returned with equal precision. Then more casually, "For what it's worth, ma'am, you changed things here, made this base better, made us better. That'll last after you're gone." Kestrel walked away from the flight line, from the A-10 with her name painted on the fuselage, from the tally marks that recorded missions and impacts, and the calculus of lives saved versus lives taken. Behind her, the aircraft waited for its next pilot, ready to deliver violence when called upon, to support soldiers on the ground who depended on capabilities provided from above, to continue the mission regardless of who flew it. The sun was setting over Fob Sentinel again, painting the sky in familiar colors that she'd watched dozens of times before. Tomorrow she'd process out, board a flight back to the United States, begin the transit to her next assignment and whatever challenges it brought. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel satisfaction with what had been accomplished, with the culture shifted and the lives saved, and the competence proven to people who'd initially doubted. The sky darkened to purple and then black, stars emerging with the kind of clarity only desert environments provided. Kestrel stood outside her quarters watching the night arrive, thinking about William's healing in Germany, about Chen's squad preparing for their next operation, about Ashiro planning missions that incorporated lessons learned, about Torres maintaining aircraft that would fly again tomorrow. The deployment had been 6 months of her life, 6 months that represented a fraction of a 20-year career, that would eventually blur into the accumulated experience of someone who'd served long enough to see multiple wars and theaters and operational contexts. But these 6 months had mattered, had proven something that needed proving, both to others and to herself, had demonstrated that transition from special operations to aviation wasn't retreat or resignation but evolution, continuation of service in different form, had shown that experience carried forward, that competence transferred across domains, that capability couldn't be dismissed based on surface-level assumptions about age or gender or any other factor unrelated to actual performance. Inside her quarters, she began the final packing, sorting through gear and deciding what would ship forward to Arizona versus what would go to storage versus what could be discarded. The mechanical process of departure, the familiar ritual of military transients. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings, new challenges, new people to prove herself to. But that was fine. That was the life she'd chosen, the career she'd built, the identity she'd forged through 2 decades of decisions made under pressure. Kestrel Thorne turned off the light, lay down on her bunk and slept soundly. The C-17 transport out of Syria carried her and 40 other personnel rotating home, the cargo bay configured with troop seating that was functional but not comfortable. She sat with her helmet bag between her feet, her flight suit still carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, listening to conversations around her blend into white noise. Soldiers swapped stories about their deployment experiences, shared photos of families they were returning to, made plans for what they'd do during post-deployment leave. The energy was celebratory but exhausted, the particular combination that came from surviving something difficult and earning the right to rest. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, during the connection to their final flight back to the United States, Kestrel visited the medical center where Williams was still undergoing rehabilitation. She found him in physical therapy, working with a therapist to rebuild core strength damaged by shrapnel wounds, his face showing the determination that had kept him alive in Compound Hotel Echo. He saw her enter, his eyes widening with recognition from photos Chen had shown him. "Commander Thorne," he said, stopping his exercises, "I was hoping you'd visit before you left theater." She approached, nodding the scars visible on his torso where surgical interventions had saved his life. "How's the recovery going?" "Slow but steady. Doctors say I'll make full recovery, probably be back on duty within 4 months." He paused, struggled with words. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. Chen told me about the missile strike, about how you engaged without waiting for approval, about how that probably saved my life and the lives of everyone else in that courtyard." "You don't need to thank me," Kestrel said. "I was doing my job." "Maybe, but your job saved my life, saved my marriage, saved my ability to watch my kids grow up. That's not nothing, ma'am, that's everything." His voice caught slightly. "My wife wants to meet you someday. She said she needs to shake the hand of the woman who kept her husband alive. So if you're ever in the area where we're stationed, please reach out." They talked for 20 minutes about his recovery timeline, about what he remembered from the ambush, about his squad's continued operations after he'd been evacuated. The conversation was easier than Kestrel expected, devoid of the awkwardness that sometimes came when people tried to express gratitude for actions taken during crisis. Williams understood what she'd done because he'd been there, had experienced it from the ground perspective, knew intimately what the alternative would have been. His gratitude came from that knowledge, from the visceral understanding that he'd been seconds from death before precision munitions arrived to change the equation. As she left the medical center, Kestrel felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. Williams would carry scars for the rest of his life, physical and probably psychological, marks that said he'd been in the wrong place when violence erupted. But he'd carry them while living, while being a husband and father and soldier, while having a future that existed only because she'd made a split-second decision that violated protocol but saved lives. That responsibility wasn't a burden so much as a reminder of why the work mattered, why the sacrifice was worthwhile, why serving meant accepting that your decisions shaped other people's existence in permanent ways. The final flight from Germany to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware took 8 hours, crossing the Atlantic in darkness before arriving in American morning. The soldiers and airmen deplaned with the particular exhaustion that came from long travel, collected their gear, began the process of reintegrating into a society that had continued without them. Kestrel caught a connection to Tucson, then a shuttle to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base where her next assignment waited. The landscape shifted from East Coast green to Southwest desert, the terrain becoming familiar in different ways. the mountains and sparse vegetation that characterized the region where A-10 pilots trained. Davis Monthan was larger than Fob Sentinel, a permanent installation rather than a forward base, with the infrastructure that came from decades of American presence. The housing was real buildings. The dining facilities served food that hadn't been shipped through combat supply chains. The flight line held dozens of A-10s in various configurations and maintenance states. It was the institutional military in its fully developed form, the peacetime structure that prepared people for wartime realities. Her check-in process was efficient, guided by administrative personnel who'd processed thousands of incoming assignments. She received her quarters assignment, her duty section information, her schedule for instructor training that would qualify her to teach the next generation of A-10 pilots. The base commander, a colonel whose career had included multiple combat deployments and staff positions, welcomed her with professional courtesy that suggested he'd read her service record and understood what she brought to the assignment. "We're glad to have you, Commander," he said during their brief meeting. "Your experience is exactly what our training pipeline needs. The pilots we're producing are technically proficient, but they lack the ground perspective that makes close air support effective. You can teach them that. You can show them what it means to be responsible for lives, not just to execute missions." She accepted the responsibility, understood what was being asked. Her role wasn't just to teach aircraft handling and weapons employment. It was to transmit the understanding that every trigger pull mattered, that ground forces depended on judgment as much as capability, that the mission was about soldiers going home alive rather than about accumulating statistics. It was the culmination of 20 years of experience, the synthesis of everything she'd learned in DEVGRU and everything she'd practiced in Syria, distilled into lessons that could be taught to people who hadn't lived it yet. The first class she addressed consisted of 12 pilots, all younger than her by at least a decade, all eager to prove themselves in the close air support role they'd been training for. They sat in a classroom equipped with tactical displays and flight simulators, notebooks open, attention focused forward. She stood at the front, still wearing her flight suit from Syria, the deployment patch visible on her shoulder, the Distinguished Flying Cross ribbon among others on her chest. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Thorne," she began. "Before aviation, I spent 20 years in naval special warfare, mostly with DEVGRU. I've been the person on the ground calling for air support, and I've been the pilot overhead providing it. I'm going to teach you what that perspective means, how it changes how you think about every mission, how it makes you more effective at the most important job we have, keeping American soldiers alive when they need us." The classroom was silent, attentive. She began talking about Compound Hotel Echo, about the tactical geometry she'd observed from altitude, about the decision-making process that led to her missile strike, about the consequences that followed. She walked them through the moral calculus, the command conflicts, the aftermath where soldiers either died or didn't based on split-second judgment. She made it real rather than theoretical, grounded in blood and dust, and the specific details that training scenarios couldn't capture. "You're going to face situations where the right tactical call violates doctrine," she said, "where saving lives means breaking rules, where your experience tells you one thing and your orders tell you another. I can't tell you what to do in those moments, but I can teach you how to think about them, how to make decisions you can live with, how to carry the responsibility that comes with having weapons and the authority to employ them." The class lasted 3 hours, running over its scheduled time because the questions kept coming, because the pilots wanted to understand not just what she'd done but why, wanted to access the experience that informed her judgment. She answered every question honestly, didn't romanticize or simplify, treated them as professionals capable of understanding complexity. By the end, she could see that something had shifted in how they thought about their pending assignments, about what close air support really meant. Over the following months, Kestrel settled into the rhythm of instruction. She flew training missions with student pilots, teaching them weapons employment and communication protocols and threat assessment. She lectured in classrooms about tactics and decision-making and the integration of air power with ground operations. She brought guest speakers, including Chen and Ashiro, who'd rotated back from Syria and were willing to share their ground perspective. Slowly, systematically, she built a training program that produced pilots who understood their role beyond technical proficiency. The students called her Legend, though never to her face, the nickname spreading through informal channels until it became the standard reference. She didn't encourage it, but she didn't fight it either, understanding that mythology served a purpose in military culture, that stories of competence and courage inspired the next generation to reach for the same standards. Her service record gradually became less classified as time passed, details emerging that validated the stories, that confirmed she'd operated in places and done things that most people would never know about. Years passed. More classes graduated, went to combat deployments, returned with their own stories. Some came back to thank her, to tell her that her training had saved their lives or the lives of ground forces they supported. Some didn't come back at all, casualties of the ongoing conflicts that America remained engaged in. Each loss hit harder than she'd expected, the reminder that training could prepare but couldn't protect, that competence reduced risk but didn't eliminate it. On the 25th anniversary of her entry into naval service, the Navy held a ceremony recognizing her career and announcing her promotion to commander. The base commander presented her new rank insignia, spoke about her contributions to aviation training and operational success, noted that she'd become one of the most respected instructor pilots in the close air support community. The assembled personnel applauded, faces she recognized and faces she didn't, people whose lives she'd touched through teaching or through missions, or through the simple act of demonstrating what was possible. That evening, sitting in quarters that had become home over years of assignment, Kestrel reflected on the trajectory that had brought her here. From DEVGRU operator to A-10 pilot to instructor, each transition building on what came before, each role requiring different skills but drawing on the same core competence. She'd been underestimated, had proven herself repeatedly, had eventually transcended the need for proof because her reputation spoke for itself. The journey had been difficult, marked by resistance and doubt and moments where failure seemed inevitable. But she'd persisted, had trusted her training and experience, had made decisions that prioritized mission success over personal comfort. The recognition felt good, but it wasn't why she'd served. The real satisfaction came from knowledge that pilots she'd trained were overhead right now, providing support to ground forces in combat zones around the world, making good decisions under pressure, keeping soldiers alive who might otherwise have died. That impact would outlast her career, would ripple forward through generations of pilots who learned from her students, who built on the doctrine she'd helped establish. It was legacy in its truest form, influence that persisted beyond individual presence. Outside her quarters, the Arizona night was clear and cool, stars visible despite light pollution from the base. She stood looking upward at the same sky she'd flown through countless times, at the vast darkness that had been her workplace and her sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new students, new missions, new challenges. But tonight, she allowed herself satisfaction with what had been built, with the career that had started in uncertainty and had culminated in influence that mattered. Commander Kestrel Thorne, 25 years of service, multiple combat deployments, instructor of hundreds of pilots, saver of lives whose names she'd never know, stood in the Arizona darkness and felt at peace. The sky held its infinite possibilities, waiting for whoever would fly through it next, carrying forward the lessons she'd taught, the standards she'd set, the example she'd lived. And that was enough. That was everything.